Hey everyone, as promised, we're back with Asaf Atzmon, and today on Meet the Expert, we're discussing.
SBOM in support of software complexity.
Woo! All right, Asaf, thank you so much for joining us once again. We have a lot to dive into today. Today, we're going to be discussing, as you said, SBOM in support of software complexity. We're seeing increased questions about basically how do we manage of course, the compliance demands and the compliance expectations that come with it, along with the rising complexity in really software across all connected devices, but specifically automotive devices. So what have we seen in terms of software complexity? And I'll make it a double question.
Mm-hmm.
What should we be looking out for?
Yeah. So, hi, Rafi. So, everyone looking at the automotive industry over the last decade and definitely over the last 5 years cannot, of course, overlook the growing complexity in managing software. And I think it has multiple dimensions. I've seen it firsthand myself working as a supplier. But if you look at the relationship between a supplier and an OEM in delivering a vehicle to the market, then I think, on one hand, suppliers need to cater for very big OEMs. Each OEM have very specific requirements for the systems that they are asking to source from the suppliers. And that by itself creates efficiency and management issues for the suppliers, because on their hand, they would like obviously to reuse a lot of common software, but at the same time, they need to manage the different requirements that each OEMs have to their own car, to their own models. So very often they come up with some, organization structures and systems where they trying to develop a small set of platforms or of generic products and then branch out of them into the specific requirements of each OEM, which works in theory, but obviously there's a lot of moving parts there and it's never easy. Then you can top that with the fact that every vehicle has to go to different markets, different standards, different regulations. Maybe on one market, the navigation standard is GPS, and the other it's GLONASS. So you need now to make those small changes in some of your systems that might even present 15% change in software on a common platform, but it does translate into multiple variants, multiple branches of each system. Of course, you have your own upstream suppliers that bring you the different components, and you may have a Bluetooth stack coming from one supplier in some of your products, another Bluetooth stack coming from another supplier on other parts of your products. And if that's not enough, then if we take into account the moving to software-defined vehicles, right? You start seeing OEMs themselves starting to develop their own software. You're starting to see efforts where trying to separate hardware from software and basically going to some of the suppliers and say, we'd only take part of your software or maybe just your hardware and integrate some of our own software. Then you can appreciate how the level of complexity just, grows and grows almost exponentially.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a few years ago, the big threshold was passed that the modern vehicle has more lines of code than an F-35 fighter jet. Okay. And an F-35 is far from a simple machine. So I wonder how much of that is really related to code for the functionality, right, of each component of each vehicle, and how much of that is just kind of layered code, something that you have a headlight, something as simple as that, the ECU connected to it, how much of that is layered with code for all different types of variations, but only one is being used. So it does become increasingly complex, and it also makes it hard to understand, well, what's relevant to this specific vehicle type, right? And so within our line. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that background. So I guess the next natural question is, how can teams manage this burdensome level of code, right? So it's not a billion lines of codes, let's say, of super efficiency. It's heavy stuff. So how can teams manage this in an era of increased risk, right? Forget compliance for a moment, but just to understand how to keep vehicles safe, and then how do we work compliance into that?
Yeah, and I think you're right on. I mean, you mentioned that there's a growing complexity of software to the point where configuration management becomes a big issue, because on one hand, you may want to have, one code base that cater for everyone, and then different configurations that allow you to open up or close some of the things. And in that way, you would not have to basically recreate 6, 7, 8 different product lines for something which is mostly a common functionality. But that by itself creates some problems, because first of all, you may have, your low end vehicles, have to basically carry some pieces of code that they're not really using. If you want to add another level of that, I mean, just look at the fact that a lot of the code is open source. A lot of the code is pretty much being driven from repositories that are out there in the world. I mean, the idea of infotainment systems and the fact that now customers and drivers want to have their Android or their Apple CarPlay with the Spotify and all these applications pretty much drove a lot of the industry to start bringing in a full Android operating system, obviously, or many applications or things around that, where they don't necessarily have the full control over the code base, right? Maybe Google has it, maybe the application developers have it, and then you end up carrying a lot of software than, what you might require, essentially.
I mean, you're also taking, when we discuss Android, for example, and I'm only going to speak from my knowledge. I'm going to leave iOS out of this for a moment. When it comes to Android, there are so many manufacturers, there's so many variations, there's so many ways to crack it, that when you have a vehicle, when you think of the complexity of a vehicle, well, when it comes to the infotainment system, you're taking a piece of connected hardware and plugging it right in. And so many hacks, all right, by let's say white hat or black hat are occurring, because you have to have the consideration of, well, in addition to all these communication capabilities within a modern vehicle, you can also take someone's personal device and just plug it right in and get access to it.
Yeah, exactly. And in effect, I think there's many more contributors to any piece of software. Some of them are formal contributors. Other are not necessarily even explicitly invited to the party, but they're there anyhow, because you've taken it from somewhere. So even before we talk about security, which obviously is an issue, I mean, just the management of the code is a big nightmare. And both OEMs and suppliers, tier ones, are trying to structure it internally by, for example, having teams that develop platforms. So they're trying to develop that common glue that goes to all the different vehicles or all the different components. You might have a team who's doing the infotainment platform, and they're the one managing the Android code with Google, for example. And then you may have another big team which is more in the ADAS and autonomous, and they may be, dealing with other set of software stacks like adaptive autos are, for example. But then on top of that, obviously, you have the different programs. So you might have, 5 different platforms, and then 50 different programs, one going to this OEM, the other go to the other OEM. And then within every program, you will have, first of all, different generations, because that's going on in this year, this is going to 3 years ahead. But, and then inside each generation, different variants, different markets. So, I mean, you can do the math in your head, and
there's a lot of variation.
How much, there's a lot of variation there. And that obviously leads us to the issue of security. So this is how they manage it. There's many more teams. There's many more interfaces than there used to be before. There are many more interfaces with third parties than there used to be before. And obviously, there's this kind of invisible interface with the open source community that wasn't even before, right? When it comes to security, at the end of the day, how easy or hard is to answer a very simple question. There's a certain vulnerability. Am I affected? In what products am I affected? How many vehicles in the field at the end of the day are affected by this vulnerability? Because maybe it hits me in the platform, but not in that specific variant that go to that specific market.
This is the nightmare that was Log4j, right? It wasn't so much addressing the vulnerability itself, which of course is important. It was also understanding, like, does it even apply?
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. So on one hand, you have those kind of vulnerabilities that are in pieces of software that are so common that it becomes just a nightmare, first of all, to find all the different pieces that have this component, and that component itself may be replicated and duplicated multiple times just in one piece of software. And then maybe even the harder question is just the fact that I have a component that has log4j in a certain software doesn't mean necessarily that it really exposes me to a risk. So am I wasting my time, or do I actually need to make some action there? And it all starts with visibility. And that is not so much news, but I think the challenge here is how to allow that visibility in a structure that resembles the code management structure that you have, and allows you to easily navigate the hierarchy of the way that you actually manage software by that essence of different products, different platforms, different branches, and all of that. I think that is really what can help a lot of those entities, a lot of those stakeholders to much more easily and efficiently manage that simple question, right? Where am
Yeah,
I
I mean, it's
affected?
overwhelming just to think about. So it feels overwhelming to a point of how is it even possible? So my next question, which is an obvious one, but I'm really curious to hear, is how does Cybellum address all of these different versions, right? These kind of versions
Mhm.
on versions on versions that we've spoken about. So what does or how does Cybellum offer, help with that with teams?
Yeah, so I think the way that we approach it is by really allowing that level of flexibility that helps you kind of restructure and build your small building blocks. And by a small building block, I mean that, it all starts with the SBOM, right? There is a component. It could be a software stack. It could be maybe full ECU in the world of automotive. But at the end of the day, it's one component, and you can get the SBOM out of that. You can get the list of software out of that. That is the starting point. But once you go and understand that this component becomes part of a product, which is part of a platform that has multiple versions and multiple branches, what we try to do is really encompass a lot of that data model, a lot of that structure inside the platform. And today, basically, when you create a product in the system, within that simple notion of a product, you can create many dimensions. Just to give you a few examples, you can create versioning, right? You can say, all right, this is version number 1, version number 2, version number 3. And those versions can trace the different changes that you make to your software as you develop the product. But the other thing that you can do is that you can actually create also branches, very similar to the way that GitHub works, right? You can actually say, all right, I have this common platform, this is my version, but now I have 3 variants that go to 3 markets, so I can branch from that core component, those 3 different variants, and only within that variant, only manage that derivative, only that change that could be, for example, the satellite components that changes from one version to the other. The advantage of that, of course, is that when you have some changes in the main branch, all those different branches just inherit from it. And just to kind of top that, you can also define the product in a hierarchical structure. So you basically could have a components that are subcomponents of a bigger product, and that bigger product would be even a sub-product of a bigger product, and that entire tree of components can be managed as a single entity. And then if one of those subcomponents is something that you get from your upstream supplier, you can tell that apart from everything else that you may manage internally. So by having those different dimensions and that entire structure, we take away a lot of that hassle, a lot of that nightmare we talk about in, where to find every piece, and trying to basically create a system when you manage a vulnerability in a single component, all the different products that are using that component, or all the different versions that this component is part of their life, part of the life cycle of that component, would reuse that decision that you made only once.
You know
if that
those
makes sense.
pictures that people create, artists create on their iPads or like digital art where they just keep like zooming in and zooming. It's like a picture of a house, and if you zoom
Yeah.
in, there's like someone at the table. You zoom in, you can see what's in the newspaper, and it's like all these news stories, and like it keeps going deeper. And I feel like this is kind of the ability to do that in either direction at will. That combined with Minority Report kind of stuff. That's what's going through my head as you're saying it.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about this kind of, endless navigation, right? You can go right, you can go left, you can go deep, you can go up, which is really how software looks today. So I mean, this is I think this is exactly it. That's the only way probably to capture that complexity.
All right, so here you have it. Cybellum helps artists create code. No, yeah, but it is. It really is an art form at this point, and it's exciting to see that we don't have to have this. That security doesn't have to follow this linear development process, which isn't necessarily the way it's done today. All right, Asaf, thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to having you again soon, and we'll catch up.
Thank you, Rafi. Pleasure as always. All
Same.
right. Bye bye.
Bye.